Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming today. My name is Gregg Mills, and I'm an instructor and course developer for Sunset Learning Institute. I'm also a MEF Software-Defined WAN Certified Professional, or SDCP, and that probably makes me a good fit for delivering this short session today to you guys. First of all, good to know they didn't hire me for my looks, Sunset. So as you can see by my picture there, so hopefully I'll be able to share some knowledge, and I won't be turning on the camera. So save you that grief. Today I have 3 goals. The first is to introduce you to MEF, if you're not already familiar with MEF, and the SDCP certification. Second is to help you know about some of the knowledge that you will require to successfully pass the SDCP certification exam. And then third is to show you how our Sunset Learning Institute's recently developed SDCP course can help you gain that knowledge to help you be successful. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. Probably since you're here today, you're probably already familiar with MEF, but in case you're not, let's just talk real briefly about them. So MEF, they were founded in 2001. Back in those days, they were known as the Metro Ethernet Forum. And as you can see, there's a whole bunch of member companies here, 210 plus and growing. And the main idea behind MEF is to kind of bring everybody together and figure out how we can do things together, how we can standardize things, how we can cooperate with one another to really come up with these solutions in this new digital world of ours. All right. So MEF, as I said, they were originally known as Metro Ethernet Forum because that's what they were focused on in the beginning. But nowadays they're much more than that. So they're not necessarily the Metro Ethernet Forum any longer. They're just known as MEF. All right. So this is what they focus on, and part of the ways that they focus on it is with this thing called MEF 3.0 Global Services Framework. So orchestrated services between multiple providers, standardized services, open APIs so that providers can communicate, their systems can communicate with one another. Of course, they're going to have certifications for not only services, not only the technologies, but also the professional individuals, which is what we're here today to talk about. And then collaboration between the community. So everybody gets together, they communicate with one another. There's these MEF working committees, if you're not familiar, that come up with these standards. These committees are composed of multiple members from multiple companies, multiple organizations. Right. So here's an example of their services roadmap. And as you can see, there's a few standards that they already have in place. And there's optical transport, carrier Ethernet IP, and of course nowadays SD-WAN. So these are the ones that are completed. And then there's other standards that they are currently in development. Right. We are obviously going to focus on this one here. And the thing that you're going to hear me talk a lot about today is the standards document called MEF 70, which is actually titled SD-WAN Service Attributes and Services. All right, so there it is. This came out in 2019, last year, so what, a little bit more than a year ago. And it is the first global standard defining an SD-WAN service and the service attributes thereof. All right. So the point of all of this, as I said, with MEF, they want to accelerate market growth. They want everybody to understand how to work together when they're coming up with their own SD-WAN solutions and be able to provide the standardized service offering between all the organizations that might be involved. So we're here today to talk about this thing here, SD-WAN Certified Professional, or otherwise known as SDCP. So this came out, this exam came out, the certification came out November of last year, November of 2019. And it's a way for individuals to prove that they have the knowledge and the capabilities to be an SDCP professional, all right? So it is a professional level certification. It comes from MEF. And the good news, if you already have one of these other certifications, such as Carrier Ethernet or SDN and NFV through MEF, if you were to get your SDCP, by having 2 of these certifications, then you become a MEF network expert. So if this is your first one, this might be a good place for you to set as your goal and maybe go for one of these other certifications later. But if you do have one of these, then get this one. And then you're a MEF network expert. MEF network expert. All right. So who are SDCPs? Well, you can see here a lot of engineers, but also people that are involved in architecture, design, pretty much through the gamut. Anybody that might have to touch or design or see an SD-WAN design. All right. And what kind of companies get benefits from SDCP? Well, obviously, these are going to be the service providers. So we talk about communication service providers, but actually it becomes digital service providers because we're providing more than just the communications. Technology solution providers, large enterprise customers. If nothing else, I used to say back in my day for self-defense. So I know when I'm talking to a vendor, kind of what they're talking about, and can also provide some guidance as far as what I need my enterprise to do. And then, of course, systems integrators and consultants. And this pie chart is kind of showing us where the SDCPs are located around the world. But there's actually 85 countries now represented with SDCPs, according to MEF. So why should we bother going through this process? Why should we do all this learning? Well, obviously, it's going to gain benefits for ourselves, for our organization. But I just kind of put in here some of the other statements that we've gotten from MEF as far as why people are looking for employees or contractors that have SDCP certifications. All right, so here's what we need to do to get certified. So there is a SDCP exam. This is the blueprint. And as you can see here, there's a bunch of different areas and a bunch of different topics listed. When you do decide to go for the SDCP exam, the cost initially is $420 for your first attempt. If for some reason you need to make a second or third attempt, you can do so within a 6-month period. The second and third attempts are $100 each. This exam, there's 45 questions. 40 of them are scored. The good news is a passing score is 65%. So in other words, you have to get 26 out of those 40 scored questions correct. All right. Maybe not so great news, and you're going to maybe wonder why I say this, is that you only have 70 minutes to go through those 40 questions. Now, a lot of us, we go through exams, and a lot of them are multiple choice or fill in the blank exams. 70 minutes for 40 questions. Now, that sounds pretty good. But what you will find when you go for the SDCP exam, there's a lot of scenarios. There's a lot of reading. There's a lot of stories. So those 70 minutes, they go by pretty quickly. All right. So just kind of look at these areas. Assessing, planning, and designing accounts for 25% of the exam. Or if you want to look at it another way, that's 6 out of those 40 scored questions. And you can see what they're asking you for. You need to be able to size and scale solutions. You need to assess application criticality, justify an SD-WAN strategy, figure out how we're going to integrate SD-WAN into an existing infrastructure, and then what are the operational benefits of SD-WAN compared with the legacy network. The big one here is implementation. And that's 45%, or again, out of 40 questions, that would be 18 that you would be asked, all right? So this one here is all about MEF 70, that standard that I talked about a minute ago. So application flows, policies, underlay connectivity services, and then migration strategies to get over from existing to SD-WAN services. And then believe it or not, you're also going to be tested on IP subnetting and addressing. All right. Most of you are probably already pretty good with IP subnetting and addressing, but know that you're going to be asked in this exam as well. And if I remember correctly, there's probably 3 or 4 questions where you need to figure out what subnet an address belongs to. All right. And then the other part of the implementation is security requirements. So you're going to need to know what kind of security can be implemented to help protect the SD-WAN. Right. After that is lifecycle orchestration, which is 15%. And that adds up to about 6 questions out of the 40. And with this one, we're talking about service impacting issues, how we're going to diagnose it, what we're going to do to resolve them, metrics that we're going to use to assess the performance of the SD-WAN. And then we're actually going to, based on a scenario, be able to troubleshoot performance issues. What's going wrong, or where would you start to look if you're trying to figure out what's going on with an issue. Final part, 15% as well, so another 6 questions. The fundamentals and characteristics according to MEF 70, and then the knowledge of the MEF 70 components and the functions of those components and their service attributes. All right. So let me stop here for a minute. I'm going to stop the slide deck and just kind of point you to where you might be interested to learn more information about the SDCP exam. So I've opened up my browser here. If you notice, I'm at mefprocert.com, and this is a good starting point. So cool thing about MEF is as you achieve your certifications, so you do get some publicity. So you can see here's some folks that recently got their CECP certifications. But more importantly, you can go in here and you can look at these different certifications. This is one that we care about right now. All right. Oh, here's those numbers. So 85 countries, that's what I was telling you a few minutes ago, right? And Sunset Learning Institute is one of these 9 accredited training partners. But more importantly, we're going to go here click here for more details around the SD-WAN certification. All right. So now you see where I stole those pie charts. But this is going to tell you everything about it, what's required, you know, how SD-WAN fits in with MEF 3.0, and then gives you indications about the exam itself. So as I said, 45 questions, 40 of them are scored. You have 70 minutes. And again, this just gives you a whole lot more information. But one of the nice things that MEF will also do is it does give you some self-study guides. It shows you where to go look, what to see, what to read through to help you get prepared. All right. So this is the SDCP exam, and apparently this is why everybody's here today, right? Is to talk about that. So give me a minute. Let me figure out how to start the slideshow up again. There we go. Okay. So one of the things that's a little bit funny is, as I said before, you're going to need to know basics, networking basics. So you're going to need to know LAN and WAN. You're going to need to know IPv4 addressing, CIDR blocks, that kind of good stuff. If you know IPv6, you can consider that a bonus. They don't specifically ask you about IPv6, but the more you know, the better you are. We'll see where that comes into play here in a little bit. You should understand networking protocols. So of course, UDP, TCP over IP. But I think part of what we're saying here as well is routing protocols. So the common ones, RIP, OSPF, maybe even a little bit of ISIS, maybe a little bit of BGP. But the main point is understanding how the protocols carry traffic across the network and how the routing protocols tell us how to reach destinations. You should also have an understanding of security requirements. So the whole idea of IPsec or TLS or SSH should be stuff that you're already at least familiar with. You don't have to be an expert on them, but good to know. And it's going to help you as you go through the rest of the material and also when you're looking at the questions in the exam. All right. Now, one thing I want to point out is you may have noticed that the format of the slides have changed. And when you see the blue header and the blue footer, I took these slides right out of our course, right out of our SDCP training course. So I obviously couldn't grab them all. There's like 350. But I just wanted to kind of show you that these are some of the things that not only should you know, but they are also certainly going to be covered as part of the course. Okay. Now, if you don't have some of this foundational knowledge, well, we'll review it in the SDCP course, but you can also go here, right? On course, Cisco, of course, flavor of networking basics, right? For EN, for enterprise networking. So, I'll talk to you at the very end about the fact that we can also put you through an encore course, right? So again, here's what we follow in our course, but this is also a good guide for all of you to know because this is what's going to be on the exam with maybe one or two exceptions. All right, so you're going to need to be familiar with terms, abbreviations, as I said, the network concepts, why we need SD-WANs, what an SD-WAN is, why we need to have standardization in the SD-WAN world between vendors. And then we start talking about different types of SD-WAN components, including SD-WAN Edge, some use cases where we're going to implement those, some other use cases, business outcomes, what SD-WAN can do for different vertical markets, how it can help. And then we get into that MEF 70 stuff. So the service attributes, characteristics, MEF 70 service components, managed SD-WAN service components. And as you can see here, we just kind of get into more of the nitty gritty, right? So IP addressing, security, design considerations. I will tell you this is something that you're not going to get from self-study. Because when we have design considerations in the course, we're actually having you all get together as groups and work on a problem and come up with a design, and then we talk about them. So it gives you some real direct exposure to trying to figure things out. We will talk about lifecycle orchestration, the management monitoring, troubleshooting, and then final words is also not something you're going to have in self-study, but that's where we tell you where to go in a good way after the course is done. All right, so here's some of those terms and abbreviations that if you are going to go for the exam, you should be familiar with each and every one of these. All right. Now, some of these are pretty easy to understand. For example, probably SD-WAN service provider, subscriber, but some of these are very specific to SD-WANs, or better yet, MEF 70. All right, so you're going to learn these, or you're going to need to learn these. SD-WAN virtual connection, SWVC, SWVC endpoints, TVCs, tunnel virtual connections, and so on. So if you're doing self-study, learn these. If you want to come to our course, we're going to make sure we pound these into you. That you're going to walk away after the last day and know exactly what each of these terms mean and where they fit in the SD-WAN world. All right. Now, as I said, general networking concepts, something that the MEF expects you to already know. And we also included in our course, it seemed kind of silly, but it was part of what was asked of us to get accredited. And so we do include these topics. So, and these are topics that you should be familiar with, as I mentioned earlier. So the SD-WAN uni, where the SD-WAN ties into the subscriber site, that's an Ethernet interface. So you need to be familiar with Ethernet frames, MAC addressing. You also need to be familiar with the concept of VLANs and particularly 802.1q tagging, because sometimes we receive frames in to the SD-WAN uni that are tagged, and we need to know what to do with them or how to handle them. Of course, we need to know IP packets. We need to know the routing, as I mentioned earlier, because the SD-WAN uses routing protocols or uses routing information to determine how traffic should get across from one site to another across the SD-WAN. All right. We also will need to talk about, and you also need to know, the what and why behind SD-WAN. So what does SD-WAN do for us? You know, how does it help? Why should we suggest it for a subscriber? What is an SD-WAN, right? Features, benefits, comparing it, as I mentioned earlier, with traditional WANs. The market for SD-WAN, standardization. We do go over some use cases, and those use cases are in the study material, but we'll cover them in depth. And then, as I mentioned before, business outcomes for vertical markets. So how can SD-WAN help in some of these areas: manufacturing, healthcare, finance, government? So here's another one of the slides from our course. And I wanted to include this because if you're not familiar with SD-WAN, this is a pretty good picture of what SD-WAN is all about. So this first slide, as it is right now, this is not SD-WAN. This is a typical WAN, what we would call a legacy WAN. And in this, I have my data center, my enterprise data center, maybe some MPLS network connections out to my branch offices. And then maybe from the data center, I have an internet connection to go off to the cloud for those cloud-based services such as Amazon, you know, Salesforce, and so on. And this is what we typically have in place, right? Well, what are we going to do for SD-WAN is we're going to probably keep these connectivity services, or we may change them, or we may add more. But we're going to treat those as something called underlay connectivity services. So we're not going in, we're not swapping out what the customer already has. We're just using what they already have, and we're trying to make it more flexible, make it more efficient. All right. So we're going to take a look at what's there. And as I said, we may even put in more underlays depending on what the customer's requirements are. But we consider these to be the underlay connectivity services. Now, another point I should make right here is these underlays, they could be public, which means basically they go out to the internet or they have some kind of connection out to the outside world, or they're private, MPLS. They're dedicated to this subscriber only. Then what we do is we take those UCSs and we overlay our SD-WAN on top of them. So, you know, the point I'm trying to make with this slide is we don't necessarily care what's in the underlay. We're going to take advantage of it, and we're going to create this overlay. Now, the overlay is where layer 3 occurs. Like I said, this is where we're going to do routing to determine best paths for traffic to get across this overlay. And this is the foundation of the SD-WAN itself. But then what we're going to do, and what makes SD-WAN so flexible, is we're going to create policies at each SD-WAN edge. And those policies are going to help us identify something called application flows. And if you're familiar with access lists on Cisco devices, kind of the same thing. We try to classify traffic based on certain criteria to identify it as different application flows. And then we apply policies to each application flow. How much bandwidth can that application flow use? What links can the application flow go across? And we'll talk more about those policies here a little bit later. All right. And then the final part of this, which makes it even more flexible, more efficient, is the ability to do something called local internet breakout where each branch, and of course the data center, they can have their own connection direct to the internet. So we don't have to send traffic back to headquarters anymore for it to go out, back out to the internet. If the subscriber wishes to do so and we provide sufficient security, then we're going to allow each branch office to have a direct connection to the internet as well. All right. So this is pretty much what an SD-WAN looks like, and this is the definition. It's an application aware, remember the application flows and policies, over-the-top WAN connectivity service that uses policies to determine how those application flows are directed over multiple underlay networks. Oops, went the wrong way. I don't care what's there. I do use them, I do know about them, but we will choose which one to use based on the traffic, irrespective of the underlay technologies or the providers that deliver them. So this is SD-WAN. Now, if you guys have seen SD-WAN out there, you may already have seen some of these components. Of course, you know, different vendors have their own flavors of these components. So one of the primary components that we're going to see is something called an SD-WAN edge. This might be a physical device, might be a virtual device, but an SD-WAN edge represents each site in the SD-WAN. And you can see here, I even have one that goes off to the public cloud. This is where my SD-WAN traffic goes and goes across these tunnels between edge to edge. Okay. We do have a special kind of edge called a gateway, and that gateway connects our SD-WAN to non-SD-WAN. So this is very key when we're doing migrations. So we might set up part of the network as SD-WAN, but we'll still have a gateway that allows them to still communicate to the rest of the network that is still MPLS or whatever the other technology is. We also have something called an SD-WAN controller. This device here is responsible for the direct management of all the edges and all the gateways. So when I'm trying to troubleshoot, when I'm trying to figure out something, I'm trying to send some kind of policy to these devices, well, it'll go through these upper components, but the SD-WAN controller is the one that knows what edges are out there and gets that configuration to them. Service orchestrator, he's the guy that pretty much I go to for the policies. You know, I tell the orchestrator what policies I want applied on the SD-WAN as a whole, whatever configurations I need to have applied to the SD-WAN as a whole. And he's the guy that passes this policy information down to the controller to get it passed to the edges. But he's also the one that collects metrics, collects details on how the SD-WAN is performing. And then the last component that I'll talk about here is a subscriber web portal. And that is how our subscriber is able to get in and talk to the service orchestrator to do their own configuration. Okay. Again, different vendors, they have different components, they have different names for them. But the whole idea behind the standardization is for all of these different vendors' components to work with one another. So I might have a service orchestrator with one vendor talking to the service orchestrator on another vendor that's talking to its controller for its devices, and so on. As I mentioned, we do cover use cases, and you should be familiar with some of these use cases when you go for the exam. So this particular use case that I stole from our course is using wireless to connect the edge. So we do go into detail about you know, 5G or LTE technology. This doesn't always have to be a wired Ethernet or wired MPLS connection. It can be pretty much whatever is available out there for us to tie into. So in this case, we're connecting our edge to wireless, and then that's getting across to the rest of the SD-WAN network. And I'm not really wanting to talk about them right now, but here's those same components. So you can see controller, orchestrator, self-service portal, still managing the SD-WAN edges. Here's an example of the vertical markets. So in this case, I chose manufacturing and logistics. And so, we talk about what it is that this particular vertical needs, how SD-WAN can accommodate that, and then what kind of benefits they're going to see. So production facilities, matching them to requirements, remote facilities, keeping them robust and secure, those connections, preempting, mitigating production failures. SD-WAN can help out in those cases, all right? And as I said, if you go back and look at the part of the self-study material that MEF suggests, you'll see manufacturing, logistics, you'll see healthcare, you'll see finance, you'll see government as different vertical markets that they want you to be familiar with, how SD-WAN might operate within. All right, MEF 70. I've already said it probably too many times already, but that is really the heart and soul of the SDCP certification, because it is the heart and soul of MEF SD-WAN services. So it defines service attributes, it defines SD-WAN service components, and one of the first components, I've already talked about it briefly, that it defines is the UCS, the underlay connectivity services. And as I mentioned before, these UCSs, they have different characteristics. I already talked about whether it's public, going somewhere out to the outside world in a public network, or whether it's totally dedicated to the subscriber. The cost, whether it's usage-based or whether it's flat rate. If it's flat rate, well, we want to send as much traffic across that UCS as possible. If it's usage-based, then we may need to be a little bit more concerned about the traffic that goes across. We care about whether the UCS will support encryption. And most of them will, but maybe we also care about what traffic should be encrypted and what traffic we don't care about. If we're sending traffic off to the internet, to a location off to the internet, we probably don't care so much about encryption because it's going across a public network anyhow. We care about whether the UCS is identified as a regular UCS or whether it's a backup. If it's a backup UCS, do we allow traffic to use it? And one of the benefits, and this is kind of intermixed with the idea behind SD-WAN, because one of the things we'll talk about with SD-WAN is the fact that with legacy networks, we have a primary circuit, we may have a backup circuit, but with SD-WAN, we can use that backup circuit. We have certain application flows, certain types of traffic that's allowed to use it. Bandwidth limits, of course. If we have a 1 gig pipe, we probably can't send 2 gigs of traffic over it. And then performance characteristics. And in SD-WAN, we care more about we care more than packet loss, delay, jitter, that kind of stuff. We're actually measuring application performance across these UCSs. So here's an example of a UCS, actually 2 UCSs. And again, this is just the underlying service that is being provided either by the SD-WAN provider or by some other provider that's connecting these different locations in the SD-WAN. So in this picture, I have UCS 1 down here in gray, which I guess looks like maybe it could be a private connection between site A and site B. And then I have whatever this color is, UCS 2, that's a multi-point service between site A, site B, and maybe the outside world. So this is kind of looking to me like it might be a public UCS. All right. As we said before, these UCSs, we don't really care what it is. Whether it's MEF IP, whether it's MEF Ethernet, whether it's MEF optical transport. All we care about are the characteristics. We don't care what type of service it is. Other SD-WAN service components that you'll need to know and that we'll get into. TVCs, tunnel virtual connections. SD-WAN unis, which have their own set of service attributes. The SD-WAN edge. The SD-WAN virtual connection, otherwise known as SWVC, that also has its service attributes. I'll show you these in a little bit. And then also the SWVC endpoint, which has its own service attributes as well. Sorry. Let me come back here. Let me go ahead and tell you now. Service attributes, that's how the subscriber can see what kind of service they're getting. So this is the actual definition is the visible service being provided by these components that the subscriber can see. All right. So again, we'll get into those. Now, here's some of those other components. So the UCSs we just talked about. Well, over those UCSs, we have these tunnel virtual connections. And a tunnel virtual connection represents the point-to-point connection between the sites. All right. Multiple TVCs can exist on a single UCS, such as I'm showing you here with TVC 1 and 2. I might have multiple TVCs coming in between two sites. I don't show that in the picture here, but here's TVC 3. I could also have a TVC 4 just between site A and site B. But just kind of remember, the TVCs are the point-to-point connections between site and site. And then, of course, once we get our TVC set up, then we have something called the SD-WAN unis. And the main point behind this component is that it's the point of demarcation between the service provider and the subscriber. So as a service provider, I'm responsible for everything inside of here. Once I get past the SD-WAN uni, that's the subscriber stuff. They deal with what goes on outside there. All right. And as I said before, the SD-WAN uni is where we start to see those service attributes that I'll go into detail a little bit later. Oh, I guess I'll go into it right now. So some of these service attributes, and I pointed these out because you're going to have to know some of these. So for example, well, of course, the SD-WAN uni identifier, that's just an identifier string. The L2 interface determines whether or not the frames coming in on this interface, remember this is an Ethernet interface, whether they're untagged, whether they're priority tagged, or whether they're mapped to a particular VLAN with something called a C tag, CVLAN, right? Customer VLAN. The maximum L2 frame size. What is the maximum frame length that we can accept coming in from the subscriber to the service provider on this uni? And it needs to be at least 1522 bytes. But if we know that we're going to receive larger frames coming in from the customer and we need to deal with them, then we may need to adjust this. All right. IPv4 and IPv6 addressing service attributes. That's where we define IPv4 and IPv6 IP addresses that are going to be used by the SD-WAN service itself. But it can also define the addresses that we're going to assign out to the subscriber devices that are connecting into the SD-WAN. So I need to identify whether I don't care about IPv4, whether the subscriber is going to define their own addresses, or whether we're going to assign the addresses to the subscriber devices by acting as a DHCP server. IPv6, maybe we don't support IPv6. Maybe we'll do DHCP v6 assignment out to the subscriber devices. Maybe we'll allow the subscriber devices to use stateless address auto configuration, otherwise known as SLAC. Again, static means that the subscribers defining their own addresses. Or maybe we're not dealing with subscriber addresses. Maybe we care about link local addresses only. And again, we'll go into details on this. If you already know this stuff, great. But we're going to make sure that you're familiar with all this stuff. And these are again, the SD-WAN uni service attributes. Some more components. The SD-WAN edge. It's the actual network functions, whether they're physical or virtual, between the UCS uni and the SD-WAN uni. So remember, the UCS is the underlay, the SD-WAN is the overlay. The SD-WAN edge kind of connects the two. All right, it has some function that it needs to perform. SD-WAN virtual connection, SWVC, that's the entire SD-WAN as a whole, and it represents all the connections between all the sites. So in this case, this gray triangle would be the SWVC. And then at the end of each SWVC connection is this SWVC endpoint. Right? Folks, I'll say that this component right here, the SWVC endpoint, is probably the most focused component that we look at because that's the place where we are doing this traffic analysis. We're looking at packets coming in from the subscriber to the service provider, and we're assigning them to application flows, and then we're applying policies to those flows to control what traffic can come into the SD-WAN and what path it can take across. All right. And then, as I said before, we can also allow internet breakout. Okay. Service attributes for the SWVC. The SWVC is where we actually create our policies, and that's actually where we create our application flows that are used by the endpoints. And there's some others here, but I notice I'm starting to run low on time. All right. As I said, the endpoint, he's the person that does the actual application flow and policies. And we do that through something called the endpoint policy map. All right. You need to learn these. You need to be able to understand these because they will be on the exam, how these attributes are used. Now, there's other components in managed SD-WAN services. I'm going to save some time. I already went through these, but we go into detail as far as what each of these components do. Here's the gateway again, allowing us to connect our SD-WAN off to some other type of legacy network. We do talk about, and you will need to know how to determine which UCS traffic should use, whether it needs to go public, whether it needs to go private. If we have multiple UCSs, how to decide between them. And of course, whether or not we should go out to the internet locally. So we do talk about the fact that private UCSs, we still need them. I mean, one of the big benefits that a lot of people say about SD-WAN is, yeah, now we can leverage the internet, which is a cheaper service, right, than dedicated network connections. Just like a bus is going to be cheaper than a limo. But if I need to get to the airport and I need to be sure that I can get there at a certain time, I may want to go limo instead of trying to catch the public bus. So we do talk about the fact that private UCSs, they still have the benefits, and we still need to consider them for critical traffic. All right. Here's an example of multiple UCSs. So now I have an MPLS network, but I also have internet connectivity between these two sites. And so we will just take a look at this, and we'll need to determine what traffic can go across the internet because it's cheaper, probably, and what traffic needs to stay on this dedicated private network. Here's an example of local breakout. This example, company has their headquarters in London. They have a branch down in South Africa. And prior to this, every time these people in South Africa needed to go out to one of these software as a service sites, their traffic had to go up to London to go across this pipe out to the internet, out to the cloud. And so obviously it makes more sense. And we can do this with SD-WAN to identify what traffic should just go straight to the internet, what traffic still needs to go back to headquarters. Application flows and policies. Yeah, I made this point. We covered it in great detail because you really got to know them. All right. So we talked about how the SD-WAN edge classifies traffic into application flows and then those policies. Here's some of the things that we're going to look at when we're classifying traffic. And again, if you guys are familiar with IP access lists, it's a lot of the same stuff. So source address, destination address, ports, protocols, and so on. But we might also go down to layer 2 and look at the ether type. to identify what traffic needs to go into each individual application flow. Now, these are the required criteria. Each provider, they can come up with their own criteria to help better separate traffic out. But these are the criteria that are required for any implementation that follows the MEF 70 standards. And here's an example of an application flow list. So again, this is on the SWVC, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. But you can see I create some application flows. These are each application flow's name, my matching criteria. So in this case, source IPv4 address, destination port. In this one, it matches an app called RTP, source or destination IP address, source or destination port, and so on. And then these are something at the very end here in orange, or whatever color that is. These are called application flow groups that I can add these application flows into to group them. We talk about the fact that the order of the entries is important, because just like an access list, first time we match traffic against one of these criteria or one of these application flows, that's where it goes. We don't look any further down the list. Sorry. Now, when we look at policies, I mentioned these. We need to tell our devices whether or not to care about these components. So when I identified an application flow, does it require encryption? Should it go on a private network, or can it go either way? Does it go out on an internet breakout link? Does it go on usage-based or flat rate billing links? Can I use a link that's been identified as a backup for this traffic? So it's important enough that I'm just going to go ahead and use that backup link that I've kind of reserved for other uses. Then, of course, bandwidth. What bandwidth can we commit to each flow, and what is the maximum bandwidth that will limit each flow to? Here's some examples of policies that we talk about. So you can see here, policy A, policy B, policy C, whether or not encryption, the billing method, and so on, the choices that we made, and then we'll apply policy A to a certain application flow, or policy B to a different application flow, policy C to another application flow. But one of the points that we make, and one of the points that you guys need to remember, whether you're self-study or whether you join us, is this is a big one right here. If my policy says internet breakout is okay, then none of these other policy criteria are considered except for bandwidth. So, and if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because if you're going out to the internet, well, as I said before, you're probably not going to do encryption. You're going out to the internet, so you're going out a public link, so this goes away. And we don't care about billing rate, and it's certainly not a backup link. So we care about whether or not it's going off to the internet, and if so, how much bandwidth should we limit this application traffic to? This is a picture of, remember at the SWVC, the network as a whole, I define the flows, I define application flow groups if I want to, I can define policies. And then at each site, we have the SWVC endpoint policy map that says what flow or flow group gets assigned to what policy. One point I'll make here is if I did not identify an application flow in my mapping at the endpoint, that traffic gets dropped. It doesn't get to go into the SD-WAN. So again, we show you how these policies get created in the SWVC, and then how they get mapped at each site and what the results are. All right, here's a look at it kind of from the side angle. So traffic comes into the SD-WAN edge. First thing I do is I classify it. Then based on the traffic flow, the application flow, I determine the policy that's assigned to that flow. And based on the policy in this picture, TVC 3 and 4 have been eliminated because they don't match this policy. And then I go to this TVC forwarding decision, and that determines which of the applicable TVCs that are still allowed to be used have the best route to get off to where this traffic needs to go to. So again, this is where the IP routing protocols come into play. What TVC has the best path that is still allowed by my policies. So I just wanted to show you, I'm not going to go through this, but this is an example of the kind of question you're going to run across in the exam. So they're going to give you a list of application flows, and they're going to say traffic from here to here would match which one. So you're going to have to be able to read these and be able to understand how they would be applied. All right, same thing with policies. This is a kind of question you're going to get on the exam. Big, long story, but then they finally tell you the internet breakout policy is set to yes. So what other policies should you care about? And if you listen to what I said a minute ago, the only one that would still apply if internet breakout is yes would be bandwidth. But the point I'm trying to make here is you need to understand how these policy criteria work together. Because this is very much the kind of question you're going to get on the SDCP exam. All right, then we talk about how to integrate SD-WAN into legacy. Again, IP addressing, I guarantee you you're going to get some questions on this address belongs to which subnet. And then where do we set those addressing in the SD-WAN, which I already talked about briefly, and then using these methods to distribute addresses out. So we do review subnetting, something you're going to need to know. All right. The SD-WAN UNI, you may have seen this earlier, the IP4 connection addressing tells us what addresses are we going to use for the SD-WAN and for the SD-WAN subscribers. And I already talked about this. None, we're not using any. Static, then they define their own addresses. DHCP, we actually assign the addresses out to the subscriber devices, acting as a DHCP server. IPv6, I didn't include in here because I knew I wouldn't have time, but kind of the same thing. All right. And then we talk about security, the need for firewalls, different protocols, zone-based access, middle box. So SD-WAN encryption, again, we're going to make sure that certain traffic gets encrypted when it goes out the SD-WAN edge, out the TVC, out to some other site. All right. So we can use any of the standards-based encryption, such as AES 256, which we show you a picture of here, to encrypt the traffic when it goes across. Firewalls, one of the big considerations with SD-WAN is, you know, remember my old picture is everybody went back to headquarters to go off to the internet. So maybe I had a firewall here, but now I have all these direct links, all these local internet breakouts. So what would I need to do? I'm going to need to protect every site because they have their own connection going off to the internet. And I'm probably going to need to protect the data center from the sites. Because if somebody's able to hack into the site, then they can come across the private link back to headquarters, and I might need to watch out for that. All right, we do talk in detail about these three protocols, IPsec, TLS, and SSH. And so here's an example of the discussion around IPsec. Operates at layer 3. You know, it's probably the most flexible because TLS operates at layer 7. Oh, sorry, SSH operates at layer 7. TLS operates at layer 4. IPsec can support both UDP and TCP. TLS is TCP only. You're going to need to understand some of the differences between those three protocols. All right. Now, this is where I said our course is different from self-study. We're going to break into groups, and we ask you to come up with a design strategy. So here's an example, and I'm not going to go into details on this. If you want to see what this works out to be, come join us. Here's another example. Focus on the number of UCSs needed and their bandwidth for this SD-WAN solution for a new subscriber. So we send you off into groups. You come up, you work with a group, come up with a design, and then we go over them. And so, like I said, this gives you some real practical experience. All right, LSO. MEF 55 is another standards document related to lifecycle orchestration. But in the MEF 55, it defines some of these other components related to LSO. So there's management entities, these things here, and there's interface reference points, which is when these devices communicate with one another. What is the interface? And so again, I'm just showing you here one slide. So we talk about the different entities, where they apply. So ECM here, ICM, soft, bus, and CUS for the customer domain. You're going to need to know this for 1 or 2 questions in the exam. And then we also talk about the interfaces, whether it's Adagio, Presto, Legato, Sonata, Interlude, a couple others that aren't showing on this slide. All right. And so you're going to need to know, and this one, if I remember, there are like 3 or 4 exam questions where they ask you, what is the interface between, for example, the orchestrator and the controller? What interface does the controller use to manage the edge and the gateways? And that would be Adagio, of course. All right. So we even give you a nice little mnemonic to hopefully help you remember these interfaces. And we'll go over this. So, but again, if you're doing self-study, if you're going to do the exam, you need to know these interfaces, and this is part of MEF 55. All right. Finally, we get into performance metrics, active path testing, some tools, active path testing, SNMP, round trip time, two-way active measurement protocol, bidirectional forwarding detection, to monitor the network, and then what happens when there's issues. Okay. So you guys, we talk about legacy networks, but this is SD-WAN performance metrics. So not only do we care about loss, latency, and jitter, but we also care about these things: application response time, network transfer, server response time. And we consider the network as a whole, whereas legacy WAN, sorry, we'd prefer this path because these metrics are better. But with SD-WAN, we consider the network as a whole. And since we're considering the network as a whole, based on these other metrics, we may choose multiple paths for different types of traffic. So some application flows may go over the private network, some application flows may go over the internet to get from this source to destination. We do talk about these different tools. For example, active path testing. By the way, this is an exam question. Emulates real application traffic, including link selection when you're doing active path testing. We talk about some of the others, TWAMP, BFD, like I said, SNMP. Troubleshooting steps. You're going to need to know some of the basic steps that you're going to follow when you're troubleshooting an SD-WAN. Some of the things that you use for traditional WANs will still apply, but there's more with SD-WAN, right? Because now we're looking at applications, and we're looking at application flows being sent one way, another application flow being sent a different way, and so on. We do look into link problems with the WAN carrier, right? So how would we troubleshoot that? All right. And so that's kind of the concepts that we cover. And this would be what I said, final words in the table of contents. So this is a list of the exam references that MEF indicates. And you can see there's actually a lot there. It's some of it's pretty interesting reading. Some of it's a little boring, right? But you don't need to get this from us. You can get this from MEF, this list of exam references. But when they test you, they will expect that you've gone through all of these. Okay. Good news is, if you do want to come with us to our SDCP course, we're going to make sure that you know it. And you're going to walk away knowing everything that's in those exam references because we use those as our sources. The people that teach SDCP with Sunset, where is it? Anyhow, we're all SDCPs. All right. It is an accredited course. Looks like, oh, we are an accredited training partner. That's good. There we are. So every time you come to our SDCP course, the instructor is going to be an SDCP. So it's going to be a person that's gone through the exam, knows what the exam's about, and how best to prepare you. The other thing that I just added recently, the other thing that I just added recently, because we just had our pilot teach last week, was we had 3 MEF members attend our pilot teach. And of those 3 MEF members, 2 of them, by the way, were some of the exam writers. 2 of them scored our course as outstanding, and the other one scored it as very good. So apparently they thought that our course was pretty well done. So it might be a good thing for you to consider as well. All right. So again, we're going to teach you MEF. We're going to teach you SDCP content in 3 days. We're going to use all of that MEF self-study material that I just showed you. We have those design activities. We have some other hands-on activities that we'd like to have you go through to help reinforce what you learned with the lectures. Group discussions. We are, even though we don't follow the order of the blueprint, we make sure everything in the exam blueprint has been covered. And we are going to give you those practice questions during the class. And if you get something wrong, we're going to help you understand why. And then, of course, we're going to be here afterwards. So you'll be glad to know SD-WAN Certified Professional course from Sunset Learning Institute. Our next one, or actually our first one after the pilot, is October 19th through the 21st. Cost is $27.95 for those 3 days. But our marketing folks have given us a promo code to give you, so 20 MEF for 20% off. And you can see here, if you are going to do it, you need to use it before the day before to get that discount. All right. Unfortunately, I told you Encore was a good place to go for networking basics. It runs the same week, $42.95. But if you do need the basics, maybe you go to Encore first, and then maybe come to our next SDCP course, right? If you're not familiar with Sunset, you may not know this term, guaranteed to run. When we say guaranteed to run, even if we have 1 enrollment, this course will run. We're not going to come back to you and say, hey, you know, because of low enrollment, we need to reschedule this. So if you sign up for this, it's going to happen. All right. So here's SDCP, here's Encore for you to maybe take advantage of. I tried to convince them to give me another promo called like 10 for Gregg, where you get 10% off and then Gregg gets a 10% commission, but they wouldn't go for it. But this will indeed work. These are authorized promo codes for you. And then finally, if you do want to learn more about SD-WAN from a particular vendor, we also offer the Cisco SD-WAN 300 course. The next one is September 28th for that week, $4,000, and you get a promo code on that one as well. So the point I want to make right now, SDCP is the MEF vendor agnostic standards, but this would certainly be Cisco's implementation of SD-WAN. So the controller would be the vSmart, the orchestrator would be the vBond, the management would be vManage, and of course the vEdges would be either vEdges, or sorry, the SD-WAN edges would be either the vEdges or the cEdges when they come from Cisco. All right, and I think that's all I have for today. And I didn't go too far over time. I apologize. I was supposed to stay within an hour. But if you guys know instructors, you know that we have a hard time staying within a certain amount of time. So any questions that I can address? And anybody that, you know, if you don't have any questions, we'll certainly look forward to seeing you at one of our courses. So, All right, there is one question in the Q&A. Is the SD-WAN edge an actual physical box at each endpoint? Therefore, there's single point of failure or VCPEs, SD-WAN edge? Yes. And I didn't show you because, again, I'm limited in the number of slides that I was showing you. But we do talk about having actually multiple CPEs for redundancy, for resiliency. But they can also be VCPEs. So they can be either physical or they can be virtual. So they can be VCPEs, or they can also fit on a term called UCPEs, right? Universal CPEs. So that do more than just be an SD-WAN edge. So those are there. So hopefully that answers it. Any other questions? You guys, you can use the Q&A. Let me figure out where the chat box is. There it is. All right, and looks like Kristen, you did a pretty good job of giving these folks links for these courses. Does anybody else have any other questions? Anything else? So does the Cisco SD-WAN cert focus on Meraki or Viptela? Viptela. So when I said V-Edge, that's actually the original Viptela SD-WAN edge. And then, of course, Cisco came out with their own flavor called C-Edge. But the controller is still vSmart. The orchestrator is still vBond. The management, as I said, is still vManage. And you can guess where the V out of those terms comes from. All right. Thanks, everyone, for attending. And like I said, we would love to see you at certainly the SDCP, but if you need to do SD-WAN 300 for Cisco's flavor or the Encore for the basics, we'd love to see you there as well. All right. So thanks very much, everyone.